He thought winning farmland in a gamble meant soil to till and crops to grow. But when massive farm women stepped from the fields and said, "We need your seed before winter," it left only one question: had he won land, or bound himself to a fate no man could escape? The lamp smoke curled in the rafters of the rusted spur saloon as dice rattled across the scarred oak table. Calder Pike leaned back in his chair, hat tilted low, watching the ivory cubes tumble. He'd been riding the edges of luck for years, but tonight, fate seemed to have pulled up a chair beside him. The pot in the center of the table was fat with coins, deeds, and promises scrawled on parchment. When the last die settled, Calder's opponent, an oil-slick man with rings on every finger, paled. Calder's hand was steady as he reached for the deed that lay on top. "Elderwood Valley farmland," the man muttered, bitterness dripping from his voice. "Take it then. You'll regret it soon enough." Calder tucked the parchment into his vest without blinking. He didn't believe in omens, and he'd learned not to listen when beaten men tried to poison a victory. Land meant stability, crops, and a place to rest bones weary from drifting. For a man who'd spent years chasing wages from cattle drives and card tables, the promise of soil beneath his boots was a kind of miracle. By morning, Calder was on the trail. The deed named the place plain enough: 200 acres tucked beyond a ridge where the river split and the valley widened. Men at the saloon had spoken of Elderwood in hushed tones, as if it were a story best left untold. Calder ignored the whispers. What mattered was that it was his now, won fair. The ride carried him through thinning pines into fields gone gold with autumn. The air grew sharp, smelling of turned earth and distant rain. He imagined neat rows of corn and wheat, a sturdy barn, maybe even a cabin to keep out the coming winter. For the first time in years, he thought of settling instead of moving on. As dusk fell, Calder crested the ridge. Below lay Elderwood Valley. The land stretched wide, fertile, and waiting. Fences crisscrossed the fields, though he knew he hadn't built them. Smoke curled from chimneys, two signs of life where there should have been emptiness. He reined in his horse, narrowing his eyes. Shadows moved among the rows, tall figures bent over the earth. At first he thought them men, but the silhouettes were too broad, too towering. Even at a distance, their size made his skin prickle. The last light bled across the sky as one of the figures turned, lifting something heavy with ease. An entire hay bale, hoisted as though it weighed no more than a sack of flour. Calder's breath caught. Whoever these people were, they weren't ordinary farmers. He checked the deed again under the fading light, tracing the ink with his finger. His name was written clear as day. This was supposed to be his land. Yet the valley below was alive with giants. And as the chill of night crept over the ridge, Calder couldn't shake the feeling that they already knew he was coming. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video. The next morning broke cold and pale, frost painting silver edges on the grass as Calder Pike guided his horse down into Elderwood Valley. The deed in his vest felt heavier with every step closer. He had expected silence, maybe a fallow field waiting for his hand. Instead, the valley was awake with movement. He rode past fences too straight and barns too solid to have been abandoned. The earth was freshly tilled, rows of crops still standing, even this late in the season. And then he saw them women, enormous in frame, working the land as if it were stitched into their bones. The first stood nearly as tall as the barn door she carried open on her shoulder. Another swung an axe into a stump, splitting it clean in one blow that would have taken any ordinary man 3 strikes. Calder slowed his horse. Their bodies were built like oaks, towering, broad-shouldered, their sun-browned skin shining with sweat despite the chill. One by one, their heads turned toward him. The weight of their gazes pressed on him heavier than any bullet he'd ever faced. They weren't startled. They weren't afraid. It was as though they'd been waiting. "You've come late," one called, her voice rolling across the field like thunder. She set down her axe and wiped her hands on her apron. though the cloth looked more like a sail than anything made for cooking. Winter's nearly on us. Calder tightened his grip on the reins. This land is mine. I won it fair. He pulled the deed from his vest and held it high, the parchment catching in the light. The women exchanged looks, then laughter deep, booming and unsettling. Another, taller still, stepped forward. Her hair was the color of harvest wheat, her eyes sharp as broken glass. She leaned on the fence rail, and the wood creaked under her weight. Paper means little here, she said. Elderwood obeys older laws. You may hold your claim, but land doesn't answer to ink. It answers to blood. Calder's horse shifted beneath him, uneasy. He scanned the valley. More women were emerging from the fields, from the barn, from the smoke of the chimneys. They ringed him slowly, a circle without menace yet with no room for escape. "What is it you want?" he asked, his voice steady though his gut twisted. The wheat-haired woman's gaze did not waver. "We want what the land has starved us of. Our numbers have dwindled. Our strength will fade without it." She stepped closer, her shadow falling over him. "We need your seed before winter." The words struck like a hammer. Calder sat rigid, the meaning plain. His throat tightened, but he forced himself not to flinch. "You'd best ride on if you think I'll bend to that," he said. Her lips curved, not in kindness, but in certainty. "You'll learn soon enough. The valley doesn't let go of what it claims." The circle of massive women closed tighter, their eyes fixed on him as the frost melted into the soil beneath his horse's hooves. Calder Pike slid down from his saddle, boots crunching against the frost-hardened soil. The towering women closed their circle, their shadows stretching long in the weak morning Sunday. He pulled the deed from his vest again, holding it firm, as if the ink could shield him. "This land is mine," Calder said, his voice low but steady. "Won it fair across a card table. The law will stand by it." The woman with wheat-colored hair stepped forward, her massive frame blotting out the ridge behind her. She took the paper from his hand with startling ease, squinting at the letters as though humoring him. Then, without ceremony, she tore the deed in half. The parchment fluttered to the ground like dying leaves. Calder stiffened. "That's legal property." "Not here," she replied, her tone as unyielding as stone. "Elderwood doesn't answer to courts or cards. Our law is older." Another woman, dark-haired and broad as a blacksmith's forge, spoke from the fence line. "This valley has never belonged to men. It is soil kept by women, passed from mother to daughter since the first plow broke ground. You, stepping across the ridge, changes nothing." Calder's temper flared, though he knew better than to show it. "If that's so, why speak of needing me? If you've lived without men, then keep on without them." The wheat-haired woman's expression hardened. "Because winter comes and our line thins. The last of our mothers died in the spring. Without new blood, Elderwood will starve. The fields themselves feel it less yield, weaker stalks. The valley calls for strength." Her words hung in the cold air, heavy and strange. Calder had heard of clans with their own ways, but never a place where women ruled so openly, nor spoke of survival in such desperate terms. "You think I'll just surrender to your traditions?" he asked. The dark-haired woman folded her arms, her biceps thick as fence posts. "You'll stay because no man leaves once chosen. Elderwood takes what it needs." Calder glanced at the ridge behind him. It wasn't far, but their eyes told him he wouldn't reach it without a fight. He straightened his coat, drawing in a breath. "I'm not cattle to be traded, and I'm not seed to be sown. I'll find my own way out if I must." The wheat-haired woman studied him for a long moment. Then she gave a slow nod, as though measuring his spirit. "Pride suits you, but pride won't fill these fields. We'll see how long you keep your words when the valley begins its work." The circle loosened, but not out of mercy. Calder sensed it was more like a net slackening, letting him think he was free when the cords still held fast. The barn loomed behind them. The crops swayed unnaturally in the breeze, and the land itself seemed to breathe beneath his boots. Calder realized then the truth. The women weren't bluffing. The valley had claimed him, and they intended to see that claim through. That night, Calder Pike couldn't rest. The barn the women had given him for shelter smelled of hay and smoke, but the quiet pressed against his ears like a weight. Outside, he heard their movements, heavy steps across the earth, the groan of timbers as they worked even after dark, the murmur of voices too low for him to catch. He sat on a crate, staring at the broken deed in his hands. Torn paper couldn't undo his claim, he told himself. Still, the way they'd spoken so sure, so final, gnawed at him. If this valley had lived by its own rules for generations, then what chance did a lone drifter with a scrap of ink have against it? Curiosity outweighed fear. Near midnight, he pushed open the barn door. The valley stretched before him, silvered by moonlight. Mist clung low to the fields, turning fences into ghostly outlines. Calder slipped into the dark, his boots crunching softly on frozen ground. He followed the tilled rows. The soil felt strange beneath him, too warm, as if the earth itself held a heartbeat. His fingers brushed the dirt. It pulsed faintly, almost like flesh. He jerked back, his chest tight. This wasn't ordinary farmland. Further on, he found markings carved into stones at the edge of the field. Spirals, circles, crude figures of women towering over smaller shapes. Fertility symbols, he realized. The kind he'd once seen in an Apache camp, though rougher, older. Beneath the carvings lay bones half buried in the dirt. Some belonged to cattle, but others, all longer, straighter, disturbingly human. Calder's breath fogged in the cold. He crouched closer, brushing dirt from a weathered jawbone. Men had been here before him, men who hadn't walked away. A twig snapped behind him. He spun, hand on his revolver. From the mist emerged one of the women, her size magnified by the moonlight. Her braid swung like a rope over her shoulder. She carried a lantern that threw firelight across her broad face. "You shouldn't walk the fields at night," she said. Her tone wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of warning. Calder kept his hand near his gun, though he didn't draw. "Then tell me why the earth beats like a drum. Tell me whose bones lie buried here." She stepped closer, her shadow falling over the stones. "They are the ones who came before you. Some stayed, some fought. All became part of the valley. Elderwood remembers." Her words chilled him more than the frost ever could. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked. Her gaze held his, unwavering. "The soil will take what is owed, with or without your consent." The lantern flame flickered, throwing wild shapes across the carvings. Calder backed away, unease crawling up his spine. He thought of the warmth in the soil, the bones beneath his boots, and the certainty in her voice. As he returned to the barn, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound low and steady. It wasn't the women's voices. It was the valley itself, breathing in the dark. At dawn, Calder Pike was roused by the sound of heavy boots striking the barn floor. The door swung wide, and 3 of the massive women stood framed by the rising light. Their breath steamed in the cold, their arms folded with the weight of judgment. "You'll not hide in there all day," said the wheat-haired woman, the one who seemed to lead the rest. "If you are to claim Elderwood, you must work for it. Prove you are not just another drifter clinging to paper." Calder slid his revolver into its holster, though he doubted iron would change much against their size. "I've worked cattle drives longer than some towns have stood," he muttered, stepping outside. "I can handle a plow." They led him to the fields. Frost clung to the furrows, but the women were already at work. One shouldered a yoke meant for oxen and dragged a harrow through the soil with ease. Another carried 2 full water barrels, each swaying heavy enough to buckle a man's spine, yet she walked as though they were buckets of feathers. The leader gestured to a plow standing in the earth, its handles worn smooth. "Harness yourself," she said. "Let the soil feel your weight." Calder gritted his teeth. He looped the rough harness over his shoulders, the leather biting into him. With a grunt, he leaned forward. The blade cut into the soil, and the resistance nearly tore him down at once. His boots sank, his back screamed, but he forced one step, then another. The women watched in silence, their broad faces unreadable. Calder dug in harder, dragging the plow across the row. His breath came harsh, his arms burned, but he refused to stumble. Halfway down the furrow, his knees wavered. He thought of the bones buried in the soil, of the warning he'd heard the night before. He set his jaw and pushed on, dragging the plow to the end of the row before collapsing to his knees. The dark-haired woman, broad as a forge, studied him with narrowed eyes. A man's pride often dies quicker than his breath, but yours clings stubbornly. Calder spat dirt and forced himself upright. I didn't ride into this valley to quit. A flicker of something respect, perhaps passed between the women. The leader nodded once. Strength feeds the soil. You've shown enough to stand another day. He staggered back, chest heaving. One of the younger women approached, her tone quieter than the rest. Others before you fell after the first pull. Some never rose again. Elderwood watches. Perhaps it finds you worthy. Calder wiped the sweat from his brow, despite the cold. He wasn't sure if he had won anything, or if he had only sunk deeper into their snare. Still, a truth settled in him. These women measured worth not by words, not by deeds of paper, but by labor, by grit ground into the soil. As the sun climbed higher, Calder realized Elderwood was testing him piece by piece, and the valley, like the women who ruled it, was far from finished. By the third day, Calder Pike's body ached from the strain. His shoulders throbbed from the plow, his palms blistered raw. The women gave him food and water, but their watchful eyes never left him. Every bite he took felt measured, every step weighed. That night, as the valley lay quiet, Calder saddled his horse in the shadows of the barn. The torn deed was worthless here, but he still had legs, a mount, and a trail that led out. He told himself he'd ride to town, find a sheriff or magistrate willing to hear his case. Paper might mean nothing in Elderwood, but beyond the ridge, law still had a voice. The moon guided him up the slope. Behind him, the valley slept, mist curling low over the crops. At the ridge, he glanced back one last time. He saw no movement, but the prickle at his neck told him he was being watched. The town lay a half-day's ride east. By dawn, Calder tied his horse outside the dusty Lantern Tavern. The place smelled of stale beer and wood smoke. Men hunched over tables lifted their eyes at him, then lowered them again as if afraid of what followed in his shadow. Calder ordered coffee and asked straight out, "What do you know of Elderwood Valley?" The barkeep, a gray-bearded man with eyes clouded from years, froze mid-pour. The room hushed. A chair creaked in the corner, but no one spoke. Finally, the barkeep set the mug down and leaned close. "You should have never ridden in," he muttered. "And if you rode out, best turn back before they come for you." Calder's jaw tightened. "I won that land. It's mine by deed." The barkeep's laugh was humorless. Men have carried deeds before. Fine parchment, bold signatures. They all vanish the same. Elderwood swallows them whole. A ranch hand at the far table spat into the sawdust. "My uncle went in, years ago, strong as an ox. Told us he'd carve a life for himself there. He never returned. Folks said the women kept him. Some swear they saw his boots, half buried in the fields, come spring." A chill worked through Calder. "You're telling me no man's left alive?" The ranch hand shook his head. "Not one who was chosen." The barkeep leaned closer still. "If Elderwood has its eye on you, you're better off making peace. Running won't help. They'll find you, whether on horseback or in your grave." Calder pushed back from the bar, anger and dread warring inside him. He'd hoped for allies, for someone who might stand with him against the valley's hold. Instead, he found only fear carved into every face. By nightfall, he was back in the saddle, heading toward Elderwood. He told himself he rode by choice, but deep down he felt the truth. There was a pull in the soil, a tug that drew him back, no matter how far he rode. The valley wasn't finished with him. And perhaps, he feared, he wasn't finished with it either. When Calder Pike returned to Elderwood, the women were waiting. They stood in a line along the field's edge, tall forms lit by the dying glow of sunset. None raised a hand against him, but the weight of their silence pressed harder than any threat. The wheat-haired leader stepped forward. "You went to the town," she said. "It wasn't a question. You asked your questions, and now you know why no man leaves." Calder dismounted slowly, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. "I know enough. You keep men here. You bury them in your soil." Her eyes narrowed, but another voice cut in deeper, older. From the porch of the farmhouse, a figure emerged. She was taller than the rest, her shoulders bent with age but her presence commanding. Her hair, silver as frost, cascaded down her back. The others lowered their heads as she approached. This, Calder thought, was the true matron of Elderwood. "You are not wrong," she said, her voice low, carrying like wind through bare branches. "Men have stayed, and their bones rest in our soil, but not from cruelty, from necessity." Calder's jaw tightened. Necessity doesn't excuse murder. The matron stopped before him. Her gaze was sharp but not unkind. "Do you think Elderwood grows by its own hand? This valley was carved by women who bled into it, who worked it until their backs broke. Yet the land withers without seed. Not the seed of corn or wheat, the seed of man." Calder's breath hitched. The words he'd heard whispered before were laid bare now, stripped of mystery. "Our daughters grow fewer," the matron continued. "Each winter takes more than the spring returns. Without new blood, our line ends, and the valley dies with us. That is why you were called across the ridge." "I wasn't called," Calder snapped. "I won this land fair. Chance put me here." The matron shook her head. "Chance is a word men cling to when they do not see the threads that bind. Elderwood does not leave such things to die." Behind her, murmurs rose. Some of the women nodded, grim with agreement. Others bristled. One younger woman, with braids down her back, stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "Why should we wait on his choice? He should be bound tonight before winter steals another season." A rival answered sharply. "And drive him to madness as you did with the last? The soil remembers the cries of unwilling men. That is not strength, it is waste." The circle trembled on the edge of division. Calder saw it, the split between those who demanded force and those who counseled patience. He knew enough of people to recognize that factions could be more dangerous than any outside enemy. The matron raised a hand, silencing them. "He must choose," she declared. "If he gives freely, the valley will flourish. If he refuses," her gaze hardened, "then Elderwood will claim him all the same." Calder's heart hammered. The choice laid before him was no choice at all. Surrender to their need, or fight a valley that seemed alive. As the first cold breath of winter swept across the fields, he realized the women weren't the only ones bound to Elderwood. The land itself had cast its lot with him. The first snow came early. It drifted across Elderwood Valley in pale sheets, clinging to the furrows and fence posts. Calder Pike woke to the sound of shouting, rough and urgent, echoing from the barn. He shoved open the door to find chaos. Inside, two factions of the massive women squared off, their voices booming loud enough to rattle the rafters. The younger ones, led by the braid-haired woman, demanded action. "He stalls, he mocks our needs. The valley weakens with every day wasted." Across from them stood the wheat-haired leader and several others, their arms crossed like stone pillars. "Force will break him," she countered. "And broken men bring only ruin. We cannot risk another madness." The matron was absent, and without her, the barn had become a storm. Calder felt every eye snap toward him as he stepped in. He realized then that he was no longer just a trespasser or a prize. He was the fulcrum of their survival and their division. The braid-haired woman advanced, her steps shaking dust from the rafters. "Enough talk. He belongs to the soil now. Her hand reached for him, broad fingers curling like a trap. Calder drew his revolver, not to fire, but to halt her. The cold steel caught the lantern light. "Don't," he said. His voice carried more command than he felt. The barn stilled for a heartbeat. Then the wheat-haired leader cut in, her tone sharp. "Stand down, Mara." He saved himself with the plow. He's earned the right to breathe another season. But Mara's fury only grew. And while we wait, the valley rots. Every man before him was given time, and what did it bring us? Graves in the soil. Her words struck the others, igniting sparks of doubt. Murmurs spread. Some nodded at her anger. Others bristled. The barn's walls felt too small to contain the weight of it. Calder's pulse hammered. He knew this fight wasn't about him alone. It was about control of Elderwood itself. If he stayed silent, they'd tear each other apart. If he chose a side, he'd be bound deeper still. A sudden crash snapped the tension. One of the younger women had thrown a hay bale, striking the wall hard enough to splinter wood. Shouts erupted, and in an instant, the barn became a battlefield. Fists swung, boots stamped, bodies slammed into beams. The air filled with dust and the smell of sweat and blood. Calder ducked, nearly trampled as Mara lunged at the wheat-haired leader. Without thinking, he shoved a lantern post aside to block her charge. The leader stumbled clear, and for a fleeting second, her eyes met Calder's, acknowledging the choice he had made. By the time the matron arrived, leaning on her staff, the barn was wrecked. Women stood panting, bruised, glaring through the haze of straw. She lifted her hand, and silence fell like a hammer. "Enough," the matron thundered. "The valley cannot survive if we destroy each other. He lives. That is final." Mara spat into the dirt, but she obeyed. Calder stood in the wreckage, chest heaving, revolver still warm in his grip. He had thrown his lot, if only by instinct. And now, whether he liked it or not, he had allies. The air felt thicker as Calder Boone faced them. The women stood like a wall across the street, their dark gowns swaying in the dry breeze. They were not the fragile widows he'd known in other towns, no bowed spines or trembling hands. These women loomed with a strength that unsettled him, as though years of grief had forged them into iron. The eldest, the one who had spoken, drew closer. Her black veil fluttered back, revealing eyes sharp as flint. Calder realized she was nearly a head taller than him, her shoulders broad enough to shame most ranch hands. Behind her, the others formed a line, each as formidable as the last, their faces hard but not without sorrow. "You claim this place," the matriarch said, her tone measured. "But Gallows Vein is not empty. We have tended it since the day the earth swallowed our husbands." Her words rippled through the crowd, the widows lowering their heads in a silent ritual of grief. Calder shifted, dust crunching under his boots. "I've got papers signed and sealed. Says plain as day this land belongs to me now. Whatever claims you had died with the mine." At that, a younger widow stepped forward. She was broad-shouldered, her dark braid reaching nearly to her waist. In her hands she clutched a rusted pickaxe like a staff. "You misunderstand, stranger. The mine took our men, but it did not take our duty. We remain. We endure." The others murmured their agreement, voices low and resonant, blending into something that sounded more like chant than speech. Calder felt his pulse quicken. He had stared down outlaws, card-sharps, and crooked sheriffs in his time, but never had he felt such an uncanny weight pressing in on him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his hand still resting on his Colt, though he knew bullets might not buy him safety here. The matriarch's eyes bore into him. "You were sent, whether by law or fate. By coming, you have accepted more than deeds and titles. You carry the burden our men left unfinished." Calder swallowed, forcing a chuckle. "I came here for silver, not sermons." Another widow, her face hollowed but her body towering, stepped out from the line. Her voice was cold and certain. "Silver bought blood. The mine is not just earth, it is hunger. To still do it, there must be continuity. That is why you were called. Their words tangled in his mind, too heavy with meaning to ignore. Continuance? He repeated, his voice hard but wary. The widows exchanged glances again, and together, as if bound by one will, they answered, "Your seed belongs to us." The phrase struck him like a hammer blow. Calder's breath caught. He scanned their faces, searching for jest, but saw none. Each woman's eyes burned with conviction, as though they were bound by an oath older than the town itself. His instinct screamed to mount his horse and ride until the town was a memory. Yet something deeper rooted him to the dust. The claim of ownership in their voices was not simple greed, it was desperation wrapped in ritual. Before Calder could speak, the matriarch lifted her hand. The others fell silent. Her voice carried like a funeral bell across the hollow street. "You are not master here. You are the answer." Snow thickened over Elderwood Valley, blanketing the fields in white silence. Calder Pike stood at the edge of the ridge, the wind clawing at his coat, breath fogging in the brittle air. Behind him lay the barns, the farmhouse, and the circle of women who had pressed him to the breaking point. Before him stretched the open world he had once believed he could ride back into. His horse stamped nervously, sensing Calder's unrest. Every part of him longed to mount up and push east, to put miles between himself and the valley. But the memory of the soil's warmth beneath his boots, the bones beneath the furrows, and the pull that had dragged him back once before, all whispered the same truth. Elderwood would not let him go. The matron approached, her silver hair blown wild in the wind. The wheat-haired leader flanked her, steady as the barns themselves. Behind them came Mara and the others, eyes bright with hunger and defiance. The factions no longer argued. Winter had forced them into unity, and Calder was the center of it. "It is time," the matron said. Her voice carried above the gale. "The valley cannot wait. You must decide, stand with us, or let the earth take you." Calder's fingers brushed his revolver, but he let it fall back to his side. Steel and lead couldn't fight soil that pulsed like a heart. He faced them, chest tight. "I came here for land, not to be a pawn in your tradition." The wheat-haired woman's gaze softened, though it held no mercy. "Then take it as both. Land is not won by paper, but by blood and labor. You've worked in our fields. You've stood against us. You've proven grit. That is enough to claim Elderwood as your own, but only if you stand with us when winter calls." Mara stepped forward, her breath steaming. "Enough words. Let him choose, and let the soil drink what it must." The matron raised her staff, striking it into the frozen ground. The sound echoed like a drumbeat. "Choose, Calder Pike. Stay and bind your fate, or fight and be taken." Calder's eyes swept the valley, its fences buried in snow, its barns black against the storm, its fields whispering beneath the white. He thought of the card game that had set this path in motion, of the men in town who whispered of graves, of the plow that had nearly broken him. He thought of freedom, then of futility. Slowly, he stepped forward, boots crunching through the frost. His voice was raw, but steady. "I'll stay. Not because you've claimed me, but because I claim this land. If Elderwood wants me, it'll have me on my terms." A hush fell. The wheat-haired woman bowed her head. Mara's scowl deepened, but she did not protest. The matron's eyes gleamed with grim satisfaction. "So it is written," she said. "Elderwood keeps what it claims." Snow swirled around them, the valley breathing beneath their feet. Calder felt the weight of it settle over him. Not victory, not defeat, but a binding. The valley had claimed him, and in turn, he had claimed the valley. And winter closed its fist. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.